Welcome everyone to this talk. We're very, very pleased that you're all here despite the renewed restrictions, so thanks all for coming out. I would like to wish a very special welcome to our speakers for tonight. Here is Alex Bakker, we have Eliza Steinbock and Bappie Kortram. My name is Hinde Haast and I'm a curator here at Foam, and I work together with the Remsen Wolff Archive on this exhibition that is surrounding you tonight. Remsen Wolff was an American photographer who worked on a project called Special Girls, a celebration for most part of his professional life. It was really his life work. And this was all portraits of transgender people in New York, where he grew up, and Amsterdam, which in the 90s, the time he was working, was sort of known as the gay capital of Europe. Without further ado, I'm going to just introduce Alex. He's a historian and writer specializing in Second World War history and transgender history. In 2014, he published his autobiography, Mijn valse verleden, My False Past. And more recently, he published the book Transgender in Nederland, Transgender in the Netherlands, in 2018, which is one of the first books describing the history of transgender people in the Netherlands. He also works as a researcher for documentaries on transgender topics, such as Transit Havana from 2016, and is currently working on an in-depth study on trans representation in the Netherlands in the 50s and 60s. The next speaker I'll introduce now is Eliza Steinbock. They are an assistant professor in cultural analysis at the Leiden University of the Arts and Society. They're the coordinator of the minor studies Gender and Sexuality in Society and Culture, and specialize on topics such as bodily difference, the politics of visual culture, and cultural inclusivity and participation. For their research, Eliza looks at many different mediums, such as film, photography, painting, but also museum displays such as these, analyzing them in relation to gender, sexuality, race, and ability. Since I think this year, the Now Smart Culture project was initiated, a project called The Critical Visitor, which investigates how heritage institutions can achieve inclusion and accessibility. And I'm going to introduce, last but not least, Bappie Kortram, who will be sort of leading the discussion and giving their own insights. Brief introduction. Bappie, I've come to know as a graphic designer. We worked together before, unrelated to this exhibition, but also designs magazines. He is also the co-host of Kutmannen, which is a YouTube channel in which he discusses being transgender from a very personal and sort of accessible, cheerful point of view. Please, Bappie, welcome, and please take it away.
So I don't have a lot of PhDs like these two, so I will lower the bar heavily. I'm an art school dropout, so I'm sorry for that. But yeah, thank both of you for at least bringing some brain cells into this exhibition. And what I mostly am wondering is actually by opening these archives of Remsen Wolff, we are actually balancing right now the presentation you gave mostly about sensationalism, but also about the personal that you told. And Remsen is not here, so we have a little bit death of the author. Is it smart of us to open these pictures to a cis audience who might see it as sensational, while it's actually very intimate and very personal? How are we going to balance this? Because we, as gender non-conforming people, will mostly see the beauty and the personal of it, but somebody who might not experience any type of gender non-conforming feelings might look at this picture and just go like, ha, breast, and just move on to the next. So we're balancing this. How do you think how will Remsen be represented in this exhibition? And did I go too deep? Did I go too hard?
No.
I'm personally never afraid of... No, let's rephrase that. I'm not that pessimistic about the way general or non-trans audiences view things. I believe very strongly in the power of education, but also repetition. If somebody sees this and views it in a a wrong way, or we call it a wrong way. Still, the next time this person sees a picture like that, perhaps this first initial response of has already faded. So I'm a strong believer in never hiding, and I don't like the idea that we all have that we live in bubbles and never touch each other again. Especially now in Corona time. But I mean, this notion of it's not safe or whatever, I'm not a fan of that. I think we shouldn't be in a bubble somewhere, and let's have some faith and confidence in the way non-trans people view things. But
yeah, I'm in agreement of not hiding. I don't find these images sensational because they are shot in such an intimate manner. And now that I've also learned more about how the models were collaborated with and given full reign, they were not directed. They were given food and wine and a comfortable situation. They could bring the outfits that they wanted. So this is not somebody else's fantasy that's placed upon them. And I think there's value in showing the results of that. And if people maybe look at the images and have a little moment of, that might be jealousy. And I guess my talk was about, like, let's give ourselves permission to also get in touch with this sort of self-liberating process. I think that's at the root of a lot of transphobia, in all honesty, that people dare to do something that you don't dare do. Speak your truth in one manner or the other. So I think this is a healthy airing. Of course, there's vulnerability, but there's vulnerability in all different types of visual media, audio-visual media, and I think that we can still continue to learn from that. I'm thinking of Alok Ved Menon, for instance, who has done self-portraiture for many years and continues to do it despite hate mail and so on. But
Okay, yeah, because I read also a little bit into Remsen. I didn't go here full blank, and Remsen called himself a phony transsexual. So for me to use this as an exploration, but at the same time wearing a suit while photographing and then being Vivian while editing, he clearly made this line between two identities and then declared one of the two phony. So for me, for these pictures, is it for Remsen to say these are the true transsexuals, or is it for him more to say this is who I want to be? Because it's very weird for somebody who respects these people, love them and adore them, but also at the same time say I am the phony. It's like this really weird, this is the true trans, this is the not true trans.
I would like to add to this because that particular quote was
misconstrued.
No,
Oh.
no, you're fine.
I know to Google.
It's no, just to give more context because it was uttered while he was, making this series, which is like 91. But the sort of when he was living as Viv Blum and writing about the writings. That was in 98, so the last year of his life. And my impression from the same material that we've just seen a glimpse of from the archive is that this was really a personal period of transition, also an self-acceptance. So this line that you're describing, I do see, absolutely see that, the point. But I think maybe the Remsen of 1990 was also somehow different, or at least in the level of self-acceptance from the Remsen from 90 or the Viv of 98. So there is a hiatus in this that's relevant.
Yeah, that moved along because for me, how I see the pictures, because they're mostly in the center, in the middle, you see a lot of like visuals that vary a pattern. So you know that most of these pictures that you see here, they're all brunettes. They mostly have some of the facial features that Remsen has. So I see a lot of this, like they're trying in a metaphorical way, like the camera projects, Remsen's also projecting themselves on these people, but also at the same time saying, I'm the phony. So for me, I was like thinking, Remsen is making this straight hard line and going like, true trans people, fake trans people. So I was also wondering for you, how do you feel looking at these pictures and then hearing that quote from what is true and what isn't true in the world of trans? Because that's also, for the people not knowing, we have this big conversation right now going in the trans world. When are you truly trans? I don't know why we ever made that, but okay. So for somebody in the 90s, 80s, in the 90s already saying this is peak trans and this is fake trans is already something very weird for me to hear, because I thought it was like a new concept of giving it sort of the approved trans stamp. Trans stamp. Yes, I'm saying this non-ironic. So yeah, so I was wondering for you to hear that somebody at the 98 already saying phony. How do you feel, or how would you think about that in a weird way, especially because Remsen is projecting?
Yeah, for me, I hear the language of being not trans enough.
Yeah.
And that is very much an imitation of the diagnostic procedure. So in a clinical setting, you often have to fill out forms, you have to wait for years, and you have to demonstrate in a convincing manner or be persuasive in some manner or another to fit the criteria. And I believe that has been, internalized.
Yeah.
And within our own community, there's a kind of procedure of gaining acceptance and being allowed to kind of call yourself trans. Now, I don't want to pathologize somebody and say, oh, you've just internalized that, but sounds suspiciously similar. And at least I know in my own process, there was a moment when somebody said to me, if you don't think you're trans enough, even the fact that you're thinking that demonstrates you damn well are trans enough. So I would kind of maybe say my experience is perhaps similar to Remsen's. Obviously, we can't talk about it, and that it might take a while before you realize, like, being trans doesn't necessarily mean you have to take hormones. It may mean you change your name. It may mean you change how you self-express in your clothing and so on. But we're coming to see that there's, like in the terms gender variant or diverse or non-conforming, that there's less emphasis placed on what would normally have been the kind of trans language of the transsexual, and that criteria that is inherited through the medical field. Yeah. So I think the farther we get from that, maybe the less we're going to be asking these questions or debating people's existence.
Yeah, if you're the true trans stamp worthy. Yeah. Okay. How do you feel about it? Because you just explained, of course, the language now, everything is evolving. So who knows, in the future we might have less Remsen going like this is phony, or are you afraid that maybe you might fall back? Because you actually showed like this wave of acceptance, and then we go back down, then we go back up. I would say for now, let's say it's 2020, we might be peaking. Are we gonna go down again and have people saying phony transsexual, or do you think we might go up again? Because history is a wave, and I think we're riding high.
I think in Dutch trans history, it's not so much a wave. I think it's more of a steady climb. If you look at US right now, or UK, there is some, how do you call that, backdrops or backlashes right now. And especially from the side of the officials, if we look at America and the Trump ways of making laws, etc. But also, my biggest fear right now is that we in the Netherlands give up our own identity as a nation of polderen, of being more or less moderate in our debates, and copy the model of the American or the English way of polarizing and having culture wars about things that suddenly trans is also one of the things that can be debated as something you can be pro or contra. And I would really hate that, because that has never been the case in our own history like that. Trans emancipation has had its support from the official side, so we mustn't let it become something we can debate about if it's good that there are trans rights. This is a bit of another subject I'm touching on now, but I think until today, 2020, in Dutch history, emancipation has grown. I remember the way it was 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And it has to also do with numbers. More and more people come out. That means that in almost every classroom there is a kid who identifies as trans, or at least at this school. When I was growing up, I didn't know anybody else. There was no internet. So the whole issue of identification, of being out there, is you cannot compare that to these days even. And the notion of being fake or real, that was your question. Lots has changed. I think the last 10 years, mostly 5 to 10 years, all these notions of identity are also have come on a different level. And so this fake and real thing, I don't hear it that much anymore. For me, it's something from the past, but I'm not really into a scene right now. So
the discourse is heavy. So
is it is it online or
mostly online? I mean, I think the beauty, but also the ugliness of now everything being online is, of course, that history is repeating itself, of course. So what we have going on, because I heard phony transsexual from Remsen, I was like, this is actually, for me, a new discourse that's going on online of, for me, as being a trans man actually now gatekeeping each other by saying you have to reach this point of masculinity or else you're just lying to yourself. And I'm a very comfortable trans man and I like making period jokes because it's part of my life. But because I make period jokes, I might actually be excluded from certain trans groups because I'm way too comfortable with having a womb. And I'm like, womb, there it is, because that's just how life rolls for me. So, yeah, that's so I'm very comfortable with my identity. I'm very comfortable making period jokes, vagina jokes. I actually call my vagina a wop. So thank you, Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion. I love that word. I'm saying wop 24/7 because I identify. So for me to be very comfortable, but also hearing from my own trans people going like, you're a little bit too comfortable. It's like very weird to also see it in the 80s, you know? So I'm like, are we doing this whole circle thing again? Are we going to 2040 liberated and then 2050 going like, whoop, not if you're trans, you know? So are we
perhaps
doing this?
it gets more and more fragmentized. So I'm sure there's a group that you are welcome in.
Oh,
so
yeah. We have WAP brothers.
right, so people, it's like the bubbles. People find each other online in communities that can support each other and have their own set of norms. But it's for me, it's like the way churches are organized. If I don't care if there are 300 churches and different denominations, if people want to have their own church, it's fine. Just don't harass the other ones. And don't allow that somebody's freedom gets taken away. But finding support or having recognition, well, perhaps the group is smaller for you than it is for me. Could be, or for other trans people. I don't see it necessarily as a bad thing, as long as we don't. Elkaar niet de maat nemen. What's that? As long as we don't force ideas and norms on each other.
As long as we don't gatekeep one another. Yeah.
So and sometimes you have to have a thick skin and let people talk.
That's true.
Can I add a question? Because looking back at some of the models that were photographed by Remsen and also Remsen himself, maybe, but this is pure speculation, Alex, you might know more about this. At the time, if you called yourself trans, you meant, one of either gender, but maybe, we don't know, but Remsen might have today identified as non-binary. And that may have been a reason for him to use this word. But I don't know if in the 90s Alex, this was the case? What was the status of non-binary
Well,
identity?
not so much existent as it is now, but it was quite binary, and there were norms. But what makes it a bit confusing that it's also drag. So if I look at his work and I read about it, I don't know where Remsen's identity would have been if he had lived longer. And also, I've known over the years, I've known many people who it takes them 10 years to find their true identity. So people change, people shift also. So that makes it difficult. In general, you could say there was a drag scene, that's quite clear. You see Helen Zelf and other famous Vera Springveer, famous iconic figures from Amsterdam nightlife. They would, I think, back then never have been called transsexual, and perhaps not even trans. They were called transvestites or drag queens. So that, like the pictures I showed, the group T and T, transvestite and transsexual, those were the two flavors that were available. And of course, for people who didn't completely fit in those, it was narrowing, it was confusing. So that, I guess Remsen was still, perhaps his feelings of being phony, or his feelings of isolation or discomfort had to do with that, with not knowing exactly how do I fit in those. But on the whole, yeah, it was much more of the main big difference between transsexual and transvestite. The group I showed you, the support groups, always had big fights amongst themselves between those two groups.
Nothing's changed.
Nothing changed. I will keep on fighting with my WOP brothers for WOP privileges. So yeah, I think that's going to be an internal fight forever. But also with media and sensationalism, since we have these small groups and we're all infighting and we're having fun infighting with each other, you also have to watch out which group gets picked to be the one representing us. Because for me, I'm highly privileged in the trans group. You can see that I was biologically born female. My voice is deep. I have the beard. I don't have the length, but I can be ID'd as trans. So people might pick me first in line to represent the group, while I might not have the same experiences. So because all of these people here mostly do nightlife work, they're sex workers, they might be seen as bad trans. Well, I have a very boring office job. I'm good trans because I'm assimilated into society in a way that people go like, that's nice, he's normal. You actually use the word normal. So people might look at me and go like, that's a normal, bland, boring trans man. And then look at these people and go like, deviant. So that's also, I think, a dangerous way to look at it too. Or not dangerous.
Do you mind if I jump?
Yeah, jump in.
To piggyback on what you're saying, because I think it's really important to remember that this body of work was created pre-internet, and where subcultural groups were busy creating a culture together. Obviously, queens would be fighting over the headlines and who was paid the most, and who looked the best. There's always intergroup competition. But I think the potential appeal, and this continues because you still see people in fabulous costumes being photographed, right? It makes for striking images. But you have to imagine, and this is also why I framed it as research. Like, this is somebody who wanted to find out what it was like to live in the margins, and to clearly place themselves there. And I think the scrapbook is like really a testament to this, like, being a part of something and relishing that experience and valuing it, and kind of maybe in an Andy Warhol way, like, feeling a bit like the wallflower, but nevertheless, like, it's so cool, man. So that's sort of the enthusiasm that I feel from the images, is that these are people who like struck a chord and really were attractive. And although I love your theory that many of them had similar features as Remsen.
I see a lot of Remsen back into his face and everything. And for my trans experience, I was a 90s child and a nerd, so I experienced being trans through making characters in The Sims. So my Sim characters were male, and I was just going like, this is a hetero family, they need a male. It looks like me, but I'm black male, logical. But I was trans with Sims 1, 2, 3, and 4, but I never figured it out. So for me, seeing Remsen's features going back here, I'm going like, this is Remsen's Sims character, in a weird way. I'm not making fun of him. I'm just really trying to explain how I see it. So for me, it's like very beautiful to see Remsen, or part of Remsen, back in these people and going from how other people experience it. Because I see it like The Sims. Not trying to downplay it. So and that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, but this is, I think, also a work of self-creation or self-invention. Although we only see a few images of Remsen as Vivian over there. But I'm kind of curious if what you think of the sensationalism, like for me, my reading of the Lily Elba, not really about Lily Elba story, the film, the Danish Girl, thank you. That's also a kind of historical piece that's been reinterpreted into the contemporary, which is in a way what we are also trying to kind of figure out. This is a history much more recent than the 1930s or 20s when the Danish Girls story is actually set. But nevertheless, there's a problem maybe of anachronism that we are misunderstanding because of our own distance from that time. And it seems like fresh and spicy to us now, but maybe these images, like many other people, were taking similar club photos. Maybe we could see this as actually a much more vernacular and mundane practice. I'm kind of curious what you think, looking at the documentation of nightclub scenes.
You mean how remarkable or how special are these pictures? Is that what you're...
Yeah, and the effort to kind of archive or document.
I'm afraid I can't say. I wouldn't know. Then guess you would have to look at other photographers that were working back then. I do know from my research that it always has been a favorite subject, because it always has had this appeal, like the picture I showed of the bar, the drag bar backstage, the famous photographer Corrie Haring, who made more and more there. The whole idea of trans people, especially though almost always trans women, the femininity, the extravaganza of it, has always been very appealing to photographers, yes. But what I like with this Remsen Wolff work is that I think you see and feel his own connection to it. And that makes it different from other photographers who like the subject as a subject.
Yeah, if I may add, I mean, photographing in these clubs, etc., that of course it's been done, and Joost van Belle has a whole archive of the Roxy, but these pictures, and I mean Brassai even in the 30s already did it in Paris. But what's different from in this archive, which is literally has been stored up until now in an apartment in Amsterdam North by, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, by the former studio assistant of Remsen Wolff while he was working here in Amsterdam, who was kind of part of the scene and also helped him getting in touch with people from these. But also, I mean, the club was for what I have sort of gathered from this research is an entry ticket, quite literally, that was in his scrapbook, to this world, but then going with the camera, he was going beyond that and not photographing in clubs per se, but in a makeshift studio in an apartment, or in a like a rented apartment of another photographer, and inviting these models to spend 6 to 8 hours, you know, with him, chatting, like having a drink, but also doing the portrait sessions. So it's I think he wasn't so much interested in documenting the club scene or who was who. I mean, yes, there are some famous people, but then there's Emma, who is, you know, wasn't really part of that scene. So I think what Eliza was observing is maybe more accurate, that it's not so much documenting as it is searching for connection with people from the scene and really engaging and getting to know them. We interviewed some of the models, and they all kind of said the same thing, like we really got to know each other. He wanted to know who I was, and not just get the picture and get out of there. And the last thing I'll say about this is, I mean, the archive counts 200,000 negatives, which, like, one thick folder per model, which goes to show that it wasn't really not only about making the pictures, because he made way too many to serve, you know, his book or his exhibition. It was about much more than that. It was about the act. It was about engaging, about celebrating, hence a celebration. Do people have questions?
Yes.
That's what happens after 1990, you could say. That's the era where the first gender fluidity or non-binary, or you can name it whatever you want. It is what the word didn't exist back then. And I remember that back then we called that transgender or transgenderism. Yeah. So the word transgender, the word itself has also made a big transition. Now it's the umbrella term. In the 90s it was used mostly for people who we would nowadays call non-binary or somewhere on the spectrum. So it's a very fascinating part, and it's long. It has more history than most people know now.
Yeah, that's how I felt about Remsen, because Remsen might not. I don't know if Remsen did the whole medical procedure or just put on a wig and went for it with Remsen.
As far as we know, no.
We're not okay. So because I think in the 1980s, what I've mostly learned by persist burning and through pose is that if you don't go for the whole medical run, you're not truly that one trans person. So for Remsen to say I'm a phony transsexual, were they making this line by making the medical leap? So that's why my question came there, and it was also why I was talking about the wave, because for 1980s and now 2020 to still have the medical discussion is like, I was hoping we went past that, but we're still waving around, doing our best. So yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it's hard to find a true answer, because lots of factors are at play. I think the sensation, from the point of view of sensational media, for instance, it has always been more fascinated by the idea from transitioning from male to female than the other way around. People have been more visible. Trans men in the past, I think that's why it's hard for me as a historian to find older examples, because I think they were not visible and that way not recognizable for us as historians. So in a sense, the trans women always stood out more. But I have to say, the last, well, let's say 20 years or so, if you look at what media has been portraying, it's more 50-50 now. And so it balanced out a bit. It also balanced out in numbers. There used to be a much higher number of trans women than trans men. And now that is also balancing out. So I think we're in another phase now.
Yeah. Yeah, from my experience of being a trans man is, to be very honest, being a man is very easy. There aren't a lot of rules around being a man, and especially if you're going for the binary version. So for me to just walk around in this outfit is like, that's a guy, let's not bother him. And when you're a woman that's like 2 meters tall, it's like a whole bunch of questions, because I think the bar of being feminine and the bar of being male is just so different. So I think if you are a trans man and you're a trans man who doesn't rally against the status quo, you're in the safe zone. You're just done. And I think that also is a good cover that trans men had. If you just make sure you're masculine enough, if you have the beard, and that you just don't question how men are, you're in the zone. And I'm not saying all trans men are cowards and they never spoke up, but I think it's now we more have the space to speak up. So I enjoy shaming cis men for not showering. And I think that's a bar that we have to throw up at men. A, to think about how women experience the world, but also B, now that trans men have an option to speak up, we also say there are more options to being male or to presenting male. And I think now that we can push, trans men can also come forward and just say, hey, I've experienced life as a woman and now I'm experiencing life as a man, and I have some feedback. You know, I think now we have that option to do that. So I think maybe that's why a lot of trans men have gone past in history. And now there's a movie coming out about Billy Tipton, who was a jazz musician, who is a trans man, and they only found out about him being trans when he died. So they're doing a documentary about that, and just to show that it's easy to hide, and also if you just don't stand out, you're easy peasy going through it.
Yeah, a visual studies scholar, Peggy Phelan, said, if visibility equates to power, then the world would the world would be run by naked white women, skinny. Yeah, so, you know, media lies. But I think for maybe the way I'd like to engage your question is to say, like, my experience of this exhibition is that there are so many different ways of appearing feminine, and it actually does a lot to pluralize our understanding of what femininity looks like. You know, I think that was also a part of the search or investigation, and I would contrast this with a lot of other ways of presenting either trans femininity or in general queer culture, and that is a massive feather headdress and big tits that you see as like gay pride. And you know, you get, yes, it's iconic, but it's also extremely reductionistic, and it has very little to do with most people's lives in the queer community. So you get that same reduction of a type of femininity that stands in for and blots out a lot of other ways of being feminine. So that's sort of a part of the media machine, and because sexism, right? That's sort of the maybe the fantasy of I don't know, certain gay men on the gay pride committees. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
it's marketing.
Inside of the drag scene, you have something called high drag. So that's like femininity on top of femininity. So like the higher the hair, the closer to God. Well, they found God. That's how high the wigs are, and how big the breasts are, and how extensive the hips are. So to have like this portrayal on mixed with parody amongst drag queens, to say, hey, we have a new category called high femme. Let's amp it up to 20. Already explains how we see femininity and how we can go beyond that. And I think for trans men, I don't know if we have something called like high king and just be as masculine as possible, but I think that also plays, of course, because I think for a trans person who first lived as the other gender, then goes to one gender, and now says, this is how I want to portray it, is also something new, because this is how I think I should portray masculinity. And another trans guy could be standing next to me and be more feminine, say, this is how I wish to express my masculine identity. So I think also that's a part of it. Like you said, you're seeing a lot of ways how femininity is being portrayed. So I think that's also something that hopefully helps people think about how they wish to express their own gender. What I mostly see in a lot of trans men is fear for being ridiculed again, because now with the internet we're presenting a lot of concepts very fast. So a few years back, trans people became more visible, but the second wave hit at once, and it was like, okay, now we have gender queer, now we have non-binary, now we have this, now everybody can dress the way they want. So the waves are hitting way faster than you used to, because we have an alternative media, there's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's Tumblr and everything, where people can now rip off the mask and be how they want to be. And we're now taking baby step with cis people and going like, we have trans men, we have trans women, and they can't even take that first baby step before somebody bursts the door open and go like, gender is a concept and we don't even need it. So they haven't even taken the first step, and they're already in like the 5th grade having to answer all these questions at once. And a lot of trans men are fearful that it's too freakish and too fast, because most cis people don't even understand me as a concept, and I'm very basic inside of the trans world. And that's why we're now gatekeeping one another. And it's mostly fear for people who are outside of the group. That's also why one of the questions that I asked is, now that we are showing this, we as trans people, gender non-conforming people, we understand what Remsen is trying to say. I see Remsen in every picture trying to find himself. You see another thing and you see another historical fact. So we understand Remsen in our trans identity, but you, as an out, I don't know if you're trans or not, but let's say you're cis, I'm sorry, and you look at this, you go like, that would be a great drag queen for RuPaul's Drag Race, because that's my understanding of gender. And so trans people are afraid of giving it away because it might be mangled into something that we are not trying to say. And I think that's also why we are gatekeeping, because we want to like micro-dose the idea of trans people into cis people mind in a very safe way. And I think that's mostly why I think trans people are, or at least the trans men I know, are so fearful of just running right into it. So yeah, that's my feeling about it. So I don't know if you want to fill in on that.
No, I just wanted to say, like I've done also with Kamwaikau, some programming. You were the director of the Netherlands Transgender Film Festival. And when you're in the position of, well, curating, right, of programming, exhibiting, that is the question that you're asking. There's a great responsibility because a lot hinges on the selection. You know, this starts to stand in for people who have visited the collection for being representative of that era. And of course, it is and it isn't. There's many other photographers that might be turned to, and you didn't, luckily. And you selected work that is very tender and intimate, and also maybe by a trans person, which is so exciting to have them. It's often, sadly, after they're dead. I could recommend some good living photographers who are trans. But yes, I think that when we start talking about what sort of images we want to see, we also need to say, what images are we making and are we sharing, and are, you know, in terms of gatekeeping, also cultural institutions have that responsibility to be asking those questions. And maybe as viewers, it's also like, oh, this isn't all of it. What does this make me think of? What have I seen that's within the same sort of vocabulary, visual vocabulary? And so I totally agree that it always has an educational purpose, because you're thinking for yourself in relationship to other images. And I think that's the best result, is if you start to try and place this into a longer visual history.
I think this is exactly why we've chosen to program this event as well. to shed different perspectives on this material, which is there, but it's what we do with it that gives it also meaning. Last thing I would like to add is that the photographs, that most of them are vintage prints, so they were selected and then printed, or selected by Wolff and he had them printed. So but some of them are sort of redone from negatives, so they're sort of new or never been seen. But in a way, the selection has sort of been done by the photographer. But then, of course, from that selection, we made a much smaller selection because, unfortunately, we don't have unlimited space to show the whole archive. There's still that voice, I guess, or that selection that is also done by the photographer. We really try to listen sort of over decades, still listen to the photographer's choices. I would like to really, really thank all three of you for your contributions. I think this has been so enlightening and inspiring. I would like to thank all of you for being here and also to give a round of applause for our speakers.